Welcome everyone to the first edition of Solidarity Television's BRICS and China Report. Today, we're diving into one of the most significant geopolitical shifts of our time, the expansion and growing influence of BRICS. With recent additions like Egypt, Ethiopia, Iran, and the UAE, the bloc is sending a powerful message. We're here to unpack what this means for global trade, politics, and the role of its most powerful member, China. First, we will hear from Professor Richard Wolff on the BRICS Alliance, and later we will be joined by Tricontinental Institute for Social Research's Vijay Prashad, who recently returned from a trip to the People's Republic of China. In a recent report from Bernama, Malaysia's national news agency, Deputy Prime Minister of the Russian Federation, Alexei Overchuk, said during a press conference at the 47th ASEAN summit that Malaysia's policies and outlook are well aligned with BRICS. BRICS, short for Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa, is an emerging economic alliance sprouting up in the global south, whose members now include more than 55% of the global population, a population density of 4.45 billion people. Malaysia's population is 35.56 million people and brings to the table their GDP worth 422 billion, and according to Bank Negara Malaysia, Malaysia has a projected growth of 4 to 4.8%. In terms of economic power, BRICS makes up about 44% of the global economy, according to the Geopolitical Economy Report. Membership to BRICS is broken down into two categories of membership. First is the full member states, who include Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa, Egypt, Ethiopia, Indonesia, Iran, Saudi Arabia, and the UAE. The second membership category is the partner state category, which includes Belarus, Bolivia, Cuba, Kazakhstan, Malaysia, Nigeria, Thailand, Uganda, and Uzbekistan, and were admitted during the Kazan summit in 2024 with the Johannesburg Declaration. With Malaysia primed to become the next full member of the BRICS alliance, the writing on the wall is clear. The old political and economic order under the unipolar order of the United States is over. As Trump's tariffs bite down on the global economy, more and more nations are decidedly moving away from the United States and its trading partners for a more lucrative and humane partnership with China. For anyone familiar with the philosophy, the method the BRICS nations are using to build their economic infrastructure seems to be built around the concept of Dmitriev's United Front. Instead of a political front, like during World War II, this is purely economic and is not intended to do anything other than give the global south their own economic system that they control, as is their international right. Effectively, BRICS nations formed a union, but unlike the Soviet Union and its rigid political and economic infrastructure, this union of states aims for a multipolar world where all are democratically free to do as they please, and the economic infrastructure is there to support.
Taking a look at what sort of policies and political structure that the BRICS alliance deems as desirable for a full member state. On the surface, we appear to see how Malaysia could be seen as a strongly desired partner. Right off, Malaysia appears to have a functioning democratic society that boasts a full multi-party system with an active ruling coalition made up of 22 political parties called the Pakatan Harapan, which translates to the Alliance of Hope. Every single political party appears to have equal footing in the government, and there is strong evidence to show that every voter has a voice in their government. The cities are immaculate, and if one should visit, one of the first things that one would pay for would be a hotel, which is around $20 to $50 USD a night in somewhere like Kuala Lumpur, and that's for luxury. Appearances would also suggest that not only is Malaysia a functioning democracy with a strong economic system, it's also clear that people across multiple religions are able to peacefully coexist together. If this is what a new full member of BRICS has to offer, Let us now talk about China, a founding member of BRICS who, according to individuals such as Richard Wolff, Jeffrey Sachs, and others, now says that China outpaces the U.S., rendering the U.S.-led unipolar world as over, and that China itself has risen to the next global superpower, a sentiment shared by many people on the left. China alone represents 20% of the global economy and has replaced the United States as a major trading partner for much of the world. With a population density of 1.4 billion people, over 90% of the population owns their own homes, and extreme poverty has been alleviated for much of the country. Economic equality is a human right in China, which boasts a hybrid system of 50% state-owned and 50% private enterprise. So in a word, China is 50% socialist and 50% capitalist. Currently, China brings a GDP based on purchasing power parity, otherwise known as PPP, of nearly $35 trillion to the table, with the IMF projecting over $41 trillion by the end of the year, and their GDP on the basis of PPP is considered the largest and most effective economy in the world. With the undeniable power of the BRICS nations on the rise, it's important to understand what this means for the West, both politically and economically. Joining us in the studio will be Marxist economist and expert on BRICS, Professor Richard Wolff. Later, we will be joined by Vijay Prashad of the Tri-Continental Institute for Social Research, who also just recently returned from a trip to the People's Republic of China.
Professor Wolff, welcome to the program, and thank you for taking the time to sit down with us this evening. We'd like to start by setting the stage here for our audience. So we want to start with the why now question. The BRICS alliance has existed since 2009, but it feels like it's entered a new, more assertive chapter right now. So what has changed in the global landscape?
Well, we are in the midst of a fairly slow but now heating up and speed and explain to you. I can't take any responsibility for it. I'm just an observer. But I know that it is difficult, particularly for Americans, to get their head around. The United States inherited a global empire. It inherited from the British, the French, the Dutch, all of that 200-300 years or longer of European colonialism. All of that collapsed in the Second World War, when those countries went to war against one another and physically destroyed all of them, with the exception of the United States. If you know American history, you'll know that World War II, far from being a destructive war, was what put the Americans back to work after a decade of the Great Depression. And the only bombs that fell in the United States were at the very beginning of the war in Pearl Harbor, and never again. By comparison, Britain, France, Germany, Italy, Spain, China, Russia wrecked and destroyed, with many more of their people killed or wounded than anything the United States experienced. It meant that in the aftermath, starting around 1945, the United States found itself in an absolutely unique historical situation in a ruined world. If you know the history, I won't bore you with it. We even had to lend the money to Europe, the Marshall Plan, to enable them to recover from the war. And so in the 40s, the 50s, the 60s, the 70s, right up through the end of the 20th century, the United States occupied an overwhelmingly dominant position in the world. We were only 5% of the world's people, but we accounted for a third or a half of the world's output, for a third or a half of the world's trade. The US dollar was the currency used everywhere and anywhere in the world, as valuable or more valuable than the local currency, and on and on and on. Now, a sober assessment at the time would have had, and there were Americans who understood that this was a temporary, anomalous kind of situation, very special, very unique, and no way on earth it would continue like that. But we didn't as a nation. You know, I've lived and worked all my life in the United States. I was born in Ohio and I lived, as I say, here. And I grew up in this period of American history constantly being told that the wealth of the United States, that the prosperity of the United States was all about the exceptional quality of American capitalism. And the capitalism was a great system, and look what it delivered, and how much better it was than anywhere else in the world. I was told that this was somehow intrinsic to the United States. Somehow I'd always been there, even though I kind of knew a little bit of history to know that wasn't true, but that it would last into the indefinite future. Okay, here's the problem. By the 1970s, Japan, Germany had caught up. Now they were becoming an important part of the world. And the United States shifted gear a little bit. It took the dollar off the gold standard, and it decided that a one world economy was the future, and that American corporations should take the lead in going overseas and moving production from the Midwest to China or India or Brazil or any place around the world where the wages were cheaper and the profits were greater. And they did that with the blessing of the politicians who, as usual, followed suit. The problem was that there was a part of the world that had been excluded from the United States' glowing story. They got no help from the United States, even though they were badly wrecked in World War II. And I'm talking here about the People's Republic of China. And as has happened more than once in history, the very fact that they were excluded from help from the United States forced them to be self-reliant, forced them, for a while they turned to Russia, but then that relationship didn't go very well. Most of the time, the Chinese people fell back on their own resources, their own mentality, their own philosophy. Not only did the United States not help them, but they had another benefit, if you like. They never were a colony. The Europeans got little pieces of them along the coast, but the country as a whole never became a colony in the way, for example, that India did, or that Indonesia did, etc., etc. Long story short, over the last 30 years, the People's Republic of China has achieved the most rapid economic growth of any country on earth ever. And I know this is hard, but if you want a fairyland story, turn on your evening TV, you'll get it there. But that's not why you are talking to me. So, does the Chinese economy have problems? Of course it does. Are there things about China that I don't like? Yep. This is not an endorsement of China. I am not here to celebrate China, but I am here to say that if the United States doesn't wake up and look at what is really going on, it's only going to be a disaster for us. They're doing fine. Every year for the last 30, the GDP, the gross domestic product, and just a reminder, that's what we economists use as a rough measure of an economy's size. GDP measures total output of goods and services in one calendar year, 12 months. And so we keep record. The world has a record. We know every country, what is its GDP, what was it last year, what was it 10 years ago, etc. Over the last 30 years, on average, the GDP of the United States grew around 2.5%. Over the exact same period, the GDP of the People's Republic of China grew from 6 to 9%. In other words, 2 to 3 times faster, which is why they caught up. There is no mystery here. There's nothing magical. If you're 2 to 3 times growing faster than somebody else, you're going to catch up to them, and then you're going to surpass them. Let me give you another way of seeing this. As an economist, I added up the GDP of the United States and that of its major allies, called the G7, the Group of Seven, which is the United States, Canada, Japan, France, Germany, Italy, and Great Britain. That's the G7. And then I took the GDP of China, the other 4 original BRICS countries, and then those that have joined BRICS since then, right? The total GDP of the G7 is about 27-28% of the world output. The total GDP added up of China and the BRICS, 35% of the world's output. There is no way for me to exaggerate. We are now the number 2 economic power in the world. China and its allies are number 1. And when you look into it, it gets even bigger. The G7, they have about 20%, if that, of the world's population, 15 to 20%. China and the BRICS, between 50 and 60%. It's not even close. There is no way to make this go away. No way to make this. The only thing you can do, you have 2 choices. You either face it and then talk about how do we work out a world that is described the way I've just described it, or you pretend it isn't there. You become like a little 2-year-old boy or girl who's upset by a barking dog and puts his or her little fingers in front of their eyes because they think, which is appropriate for a 2-year-old, that if you can't see it, it's not there. And then when you get a little older, you learn, you don't see it still there. Well, when it comes to these issues, we as a nation are like a 2-year-old. We don't talk about it. You should see I wish you could go traveling with me as I give these talks, and the American audiences, they're looking at me, and the only way to describe it, it's like a puppy looks at you when it just did something on the rug it somehow knows it shouldn't have done, right? That look, you can't describe it. It's that look of, oh God, I did it, or I'm in trouble now. Because, I'm an authority figure, I'm a professor and all that, so they think I'm probably telling them the truth, but it's a truth that they don't want to hear, that upsets them. And, I do the best I can, but, yeah, what you're seeing with the BRICS and China is really, and I don't want to take away from what they've accomplished, particularly the Chinese, but it's really more about the decline of us. It's a decline of our empire. Our economy is having more and more trouble. The empire was a tremendous boost. Have either of you ever been to England or Britain?
Yes.
Visited?
I have not.
All right. Well, Britain is, I use it as an example. Britain is a small, cold, wet island off the mainland of Europe. But it was once the center of the world. It was once the great British Empire. And if you go and travel there, you will encounter tourist sites and people who still think it is. And it's almost cute, You kind of your heart goes out to them because it's not there. It's like Wile E. Coyote running off the edge of the cliff and then noticing that there's no more cliff under him, and then. So the British have been having to face this for a long time. It's relatively new for us. The G7 and China and the BRICS had about equal GDP in the year 2020. We were equal, the lines crossed. But in the last 5 years, China and the BRICS have grown and the G7 shrinks. Germany was a powerhouse economy a few years ago. It's in recession now. It's not boosting Europe, it's dragging it down. Europe and America, they had a 300 or 400 years. It's over and they're not coming back. And we really have two choices: sit down with the Chinese and the other people that are part of the BRICS and work out a way to live and let live. We all have nuclear weapons. We can all blow ourselves to bits. Nobody wants that, right? It's too stupid for words. But if we don't change, look, you can't threaten Venezuela. Look, here's an example. Venezuela. I won't challenge you, but let me ask you a question, and you keep the answer to yourself, but it's the question. Are you aware that the President of the United States, for the last 4 months, has killed about 85 people in little fishing boats around Venezuela? He has said to us as his citizens that these are narco boats and that the people in them are trafficking drugs. Let's assume for the moment, even though not a shred of evidence has been shown to anybody, let's assume that's the truth. Well, we have a drug problem in the United States. You know it, and I know it. You know where to go in virtually every city to go get them, and I do too. They're there. And our police arrest people in the United States for dealing drugs all the time. We never kill them. It's not a capital crime in the United States. If you are caught with drugs, dealing drugs, they arrest you, they take the drugs away from you, and they give you a lawyer because they're required to. You have a chance in court, you have a jury, you have a judge. And then if you are found guilty with all of that, you get a prison sentence. Nobody kills you. Up until recently, the American Navy would stop a ship if they suspected that they would, and they would board the ship. They had the right to do that. They would inspect the ship. If they found drugs, they would confiscate them, and they would take the people in the boat to wherever the boat came from under arrest. And that was the end. What in the world happened in the last 4 months that would lead the President of the United States, without evidence, without lawyers, without jury, without judge, simply execute 85 people, threatening the whole country of Venezuela? Well, here's what you may not know. Right around Venezuela are Russian and Chinese ships. You know what I mean? It's over. I don't know what they're going to do. Maybe they won't do anything. But look what you're doing here. You can't do it anymore. The Monroe Doctrine, we do whatever we want in the Western Hemisphere. No, we don't. No, we don't. And, you think you're going to stop that by invading? Not at all. You're not going to stop it at all. Half of Latin America is immediately going to go crazy with the whole spectacle of the thing. But now they have friends, the BRICS. You put a tariff on a country, they look at you and start laughing. Okay, we won't send our goods to your country. We have the whole rest of the world. And the rest of the world is a richer thing than the United States and its allies. So I can't exaggerate this. It is the most As an economist, granted, I look at the world with a focus on economics, but as a citizen of the United States, this issue, which I compliment you for wanting to talk about it, you're absolutely right. That is as important or more important than anything else that Americans are grappling with. You know, I understand the fascination with Jeffrey Epstein and all of that horror, but that's not shaking this country the way these other things are.
Thank you so much for setting that context for us and also bringing in other geopolitical issues. I have close eyes on Venezuela, and the erasure of due process is of particular interest to me. So I'm going to pass it off to Riley for a couple more questions about where BRICS is today.
Good.
So there's been talk of the de-dollarization dream. And one of the most talked about goals is reducing the dependence on the US dollar. How central is China to this project, and how realistic is a common BRICS currency or even a widespread use of the Chinese yuan for trade?
Okay, it's a little bit of a nuanced problem. Because of the enormous importance of China in the world now, no matter what the Chinese did or didn't do, their currency is much more important in world trade today than it's ever been before. I mean, no question. But that's for a simple reason that more countries are either buying from China or selling to China than ever before, and they've got to deal in the Chinese currency. So they've got to have a Chinese currency account in banks around the world so they can make payments, they can receive income. It's a little bit like what happened to the United States dollar after World War II. The United States was such a dominant presence that the dollar had to become what it did become, which is a global currency. So that is going on, and that will continue to go on as China continues to be, the important thing. I mean, I'll give you an example. General Motors, an American car company, sells more cars in China than it does in the United States. So it has to keep a large part of its money in China. It pays Chinese workers to produce them. It pays Chinese salespeople to market the cars, to keep I mean, it's just an enormous operation that needs to be in the currency where the action is. So that's part of it. Will that mean the decline of the dollar? Yes. The dollar has been declining for decades. This is not new. It's not a project of the BRICS. That's the part of the decline of the empire. You're just not what you were. And so people don't need dollars that much. A few decades ago, the United States got Saudi Arabia to take the lead. And what the Saudis did, they were the major producer of oil in the world at that time, and they're one of the major ones to this day. They declared that they would only accept dollars. That was a deal they made with the United States. And so even though the United States' share of world trade was shrinking, they kept the importance of the dollar because it was crucial to the oil trade. So, for example, if Belgium had an order for oil from Venezuela, you would see it paid in dollars. Dollars were and that kept the dollar going. On the other hand, the Chinese, as they grew, have Chinese economists explained this to me at seminars. They said, we're not against the dollar because in the last 30 years that we grew faster than everybody else, we grew in a world where the dollar was the number one currency. We can work with a system, and the dollar helped us. A uniform global economy where everything could be bought and sold in one currency was very helpful and convenient. And the Chinese accumulated dollars because they made use of them. So, for example, today, the United States, I assume you know, if you don't know, let me be the first to tell you. We are the largest debtor country in the world. That is, the United States owes more money than any other country. And the two biggest creditor countries The two biggest countries to lend that money to the United States borrowed are Japan, that's number one, and China is number two. China owns about $750 billion worth of U.S. debts. I mean, that is an enormous, only Japan has more than that. All the rest of the countries of the world who have some don't come close to this. Number three is Britain, and it's a distant third. So China has benefited, so they're in no rush. The decline of the dollar for them is a natural process of change. If you compare, let me do this and provoke you a little. If you compare the kind of rageful, herky-jerky way Donald Trump talks to everybody, and then compare it to Xi Jinping, the leader of China. Mr. Xi Jinping is quiet, he's reserved, he doesn't yell, he doesn't, he's no theatrics. Now, that may be his personality, I wouldn't know. But I can tell you why it's easy to understand, because time is on his side, and time is not on Mr. Trump's side for every reason, including his age. But beside that, the United States, look, there's fear around the world, and I really mean this, and I know it from my own travels. There's fear around the world that the United States is becoming a society who's lost its economic dominance, lost its political dominance, lost its ideological dominance. What it has left is maybe its military dominance. Will there be leaders of the United States tempted to use the military position they have to try to recapture the lost economic, political, and ideological? And therefore, are they a scary phenomena? And you can see it if you travel to Europe. You can see it. Really, it'll come out and it'll bite you in the back of your rear end when you realize these are not enemies of the United States. These are people who have been allies for decades, but are becoming very, very worried.
So I'd like to dig in a little bit more about China's central role as the sort of engine and architect of BRICS. So I've got a kind of a compound question for you, but with the recent addition, the bloc has really grown significantly, right, as we've already established. And there's clearly strategy behind that. And so I'm wondering about your assessment of the level of infighting, I guess you could say, that's going on with regard to the way that China may be sort of the vehicle for their own sort of for their own role, right, as their own state. They, in some ways, may be a reflection. The extent of sorry, let me rephrase that. So the extent of the current vision and direction of BRICS is kind of a reflection of China's own foreign policy goals, like the Belt and Road Initiative, for example. So is the BRICS becoming a vehicle for Chinese strategy, and is that something that might cause internal strife within BRICS to the extent that they're trying to grow and expand?
I think there are all kinds of tensions and struggles inside BRICS, no question. And I'll go over them in a minute. But I don't think the particular thing you point to is the major problem. There are other problems. For example, some of these countries seriously consider themselves socialist. Others, not at all. Saudi Arabia is not a progressive, liberal, democratic, or anything else. And yet it is a part of this. India's Modi is hated by Muslims around the world because of the Muslim-Hindu conflict, and Modi's history is not good in that area. And yet they are buddies with other countries that are leading Muslim. These are very, the There's a Shia and Sunni, the differences within the Muslim community. They have lots of issues that they have not agreed to or are not comfortable with. And if you're wondering, could that blow it up? I'm sure it could. I'm sure it's not very virulent now, but it sure could become so if they have an issue around which they disagree. I mean, for example, India and Pakistan have a long history of not getting along real well. Well, I mean, India is Hindu, roughly, and Pakistan is Muslim, and that could split this whole thing up if that becomes an urgent issue. Uh, the Chinese, it's a little different. The Chinese make no bones about it. They refer to themselves as socialism with Chinese characteristics. That's literally how they define themselves. They explain that their goal is to become a rich nation like those in the West. In a sense, Europe and the United States remain more or less models for what they do. They mostly try to do it better and cheaper, which, by the way, is an old strategy. The Japanese did that after World War II. You try to outdo whoever the leader of the game is and take that as your test. And let me give you an example. 15 years ago, uh, we had a technical development. Long story short, the world began a transition that we're living through from automobiles run by oil and gas to automobiles run by electricity, right? And we all know the name of Elon Musk and Tesla because they were the first company to do that in a successful way, and that's why he's the richest man in the earth, on earth. Okay. But now here comes the second part of the story. Over the last 15, 20 years, every company tried to develop electric vehicles. Ford did it, and GM did it, and Toyota did it. And, and then by the end of the 15 years, the competition was over. Somebody won, and the others didn't. Tesla was the first, but it didn't win the competition. The competition was won by a Chinese automobile manufacturer whose name, you might laugh, is three initials, BYD, which stand actually for English words, build your dream. That's what the name of the company is. All right. They produce the best quality electric car and truck at the lowest price. They won the competition. Okay. Besides letting you know what that means, automobile, you're at the top of the chain here. You have to have an enormous industry of thousands of other things to be able to put together a machinery to produce cars. So it tells you about Chinese development. But now it lets you know the world is now their market. Wherever the Chinese go, they don't have to browbeat anybody. They just say, here's the best electric car you can get at the cheapest price. You don't want it? Go buy something else. Well, it's so dangerous for the United States. He put a tariff about 25, 27% on electric cars from China. Mr. Biden raised the tariff to 100%. And Mr. Trump, too, our current president, has kept it at the Biden level. Okay, here's what that means. If you want to get the best electric car or truck, you come up with about $30,000. The car will be shipped from China to San Francisco or Newark or wherever the cars come. But you can't get it yet because when you go down to the port or the dealer, you've got to pay the tariff 100%, another 30,000 to Uncle Sam, because that's what a tariff is. It's a tax to our government. So the full cost will be 30 plus 30 or $60,000 for that car. No Americans will buy it. Why? Because you can buy an electric car from Tesla or GM or Toyota for $50,000, not 60. Not as good, but you're not shelling out 60. Now, let me tell you how and why that's the decline of the American empire. Mr. Trump will go on TV and I'm saving the jobs of those workers in Detroit who are making the oil and gas cars that we all still, or most of us, still drive. And that's correct. He is. He's more important, he's saving the profit of the companies in Detroit that are making those cars. But yeah, he's saving some jobs. But now let's do the economics with me. Everywhere in the world, there are companies making all kinds of things that are in the process of phasing out their oil and gas vehicles, the cars and trucks used in their business, and replacing them with electric. These are companies that compete with America. You know, if there's a company in America that makes T-shirts, you can bet there's companies all over the world that make T-shirts, or make software programs, or make bottled water, or make you fill in the. In other words, the United States has competitors all around the world. But here's the difference in the situation of the competitor with the American. The competitor can go out in the market and buy the best electric vehicles there are for $30,000. American competitor can't get that car, has to pay more than 30 for an inferior truck. You know what that means? It's over. That's why the empire is in decline. It's doing help itself hurts itself. But there's no way out unless you sit down with the Chinese. The Chinese, why do they do the Belt and Road? Why can they afford to make perfectly reasonable deals along the way? They're just making sure that anything produced in China can find its way to Europe, North America, and Africa because they've built the relationships. The American military would have to bomb everybody. It's impossible. It's a strategy that is it's global, which means everybody sees it. You can't hide this stuff anymore. We have satellites that, spy down on everybody. So everybody knows what everybody's basically doing. And the Chinese are sitting on a situation that is as remarkable for them as America's was after World War II. We didn't go to war to have that situation, but we did inherit it. And the Chinese, they have inherited a society that allows them to go. And that's what's happening. And it's happening relentlessly. And our leaders keep telling us the Chinese are very aggressive. I understand what he means. They are displacing us. It's true. But aggressive isn't the right word for this. It's mostly our decline and their emergence. Here's another way which Americans could learn from. The War of Independence back in 1776 that we're all, at least those of us who grew up in the United States, are told about, right? We went to war to be independent of the British Empire. And we had a war. And, George Washington fought the war. And the British lost, which amazed everybody at the time, because Britain was a great empire, and we were a relatively unimportant little colony. In 1812, the British tried again. We had the War of 1812, and the United States won again, and Britain was defeated. After which the British realized, don't go to war, because you lose. Sit down with the Americans. And by the way, are you from Venezuela, you said?
No, I'm not from Venezuela. I am Latino, and so I pay really close attention to America's involvement in Latin America, let's say.
All right. Well, as a Latino, you've heard of the Monroe Doctrine.
Yes.
Well, the Monroe Doctrine, right? 1830, That was because the British and the Americans sat down after the two wars. The British said, we won't go to war. How about we make a deal? You get Latin America, we get the rest of the world, Africa, Asia. And for the next century, that's how it went. And the United States and Britain didn't go to war again. World War One, they were allies, they were not enemies. But Latin America was kind of given as a part of that deal to the United States, which proceeded to go in there, as you know better than I do, to try to control whether you're a little country like Guatemala or Costa Rica, or you're a monster like Brazil or Chile or Argentina. The United States, look at them now. You know, Mr. Trump bailed out Mr. Milei, otherwise he would have lost the election a few weeks ago. So this is the situation, and the United States is losing it and losing and cannot stop it. And the frustration is building. You see it all around you. And they're going to blame everybody, but they will not talk about the decline of the empire, because that means the problem comes home and is here, not the bad guy over there.
So with the global south, would you say that BRICS is kind of a megaphone for the global south? BRICS often positions itself as a voice of the global south. So would you say that this narrative is accurate? And how does China's relationship with other developing nations within the bloc, particularly on debt and infrastructure, affect this dynamic?
So far, no question, they think of themselves as you might even say, the organized part of the global south. They've gotten themselves together, they coordinate, they have meetings several times a year, they have working groups that work on problems like the dollar or debts among them. How do you resolve conflicts? They're quite sophisticated. They have an operation that in many ways the UN could learn from. They're a much smaller thing, right? They're just those nations. But they've been able to work together really quite successfully, including working out conflict and military conflict between them, number one. Number two, what the Chinese have done is extraordinary. You know, they have made most of the financial arrangements work through the Chinese government. And the Chinese government, as I told you, understands that it has time on its side. So it is in no rush. It does not want to jeopardize a deal that they think is important. I don't know, with Afghanistan or with Tanzania or wherever it might be. Give it time. So if there's extend the loan, you don't have to pay. Take a year or two off. Wait, and this is not altruism. This is very smart thinking. In the world of finance, it's called playing the long game. It's when you're thinking strategic. A corporation that has made a loan and needs to get paid back often doesn't have that luxury. It has to show profit each quarter. It can't, not because it isn't a nice guy or hasn't got a brain, but the system is different. And the Chinese, that's why they tell you, when Americans talk about regime change in China, the Chinese smile. Say, we're not going to change our regime. Are you kidding? We've been able to achieve the fastest economic growth. We have brought 800 million people out of poverty, which they have. The UN has confirmed that. So, I mean, they're sitting very good. Let me give you again an example also to think about. Over the last 30 years, I compared the change in the real wage of the average American worker with the change in the real wage of the average Chinese worker. And by real wage, I just mean what in economics, you adjust the wage a person gets for the prices they have to pay. So, for example, if your wage goes up 10%, but all the prices go up 10%, 10%. The real wage has gone nowhere because it nets out. You have more money, but you got to shell out more for a dozen eggs or a loaf of bread, and therefore it nets out. So real wage measures how much more you can buy with whatever the wage is. So over the last 3 or 4 decades, the real wage in the United States has gone up maybe a total of 10% in 4 decades. That's very slow. Over the same 4 decades, the average real wage in China has quadrupled. Now, they're still a poorer country than the United States. No question, they're a poorer country. They were, and they still are. But if you want to know why there are no riots in the streets against Xi Jinping, because you have a working class that's having 4 times their income. You know, children look at their parents, and the parents can't believe the possessions that these children can acquire. They can get a car, and they can have their own apartment, and that's because Americans visit China. I have friends who just came back, and one of the things they were shown were a whole series of apartment blocks empty. You know, big, tall apartment buildings in a cluster, nobody in them. And they asked the question, you know, what is this? And the Chinese said, well, in the West, you wait for there to be a housing shortage, for the prices to go up and the rents to go crazy, and then you hope maybe somebody will build some. We always thought that was nuts here in China. We build the housing before, so that when people need housing, it's there. That's what as a Westerner, I remember thinking to myself, it's painful. You know, when someone tells you something that's obvious and you realize you missed it, there's that moment of,
So we're gonna go ahead and skip some of our questions. We moved things around because you've answered so much of what we were planning to ask already. So we're gonna kind of look ahead now towards the future. So I want to pass it to Riley for our first question on that, which I think you've kind of already answered, but if you want to just reiterate it.
So, a lot of Americans, especially a lot of people who aren't exactly pro-China or pro-Global South, don't really understand that BRICS may or let me rephrase. They may not understand that BRICS is not exactly here to cause them a bad day. So can we be fundamentally direct? Is BRICS an anti-Western alliance, or is it better understood as an alternative platform for cooperation that simply doesn't include the West?
It's mostly the latter. They have neither the time, nor the interest, nor the money, nor the military. They don't want any trouble from the West. They would like you, please leave them alone. Let them develop their economies. Let them help each other. Now, having said that, here is what maybe generates this kind of question. If Mr. Trump continues to do as he has done in the first 9 months now of his second presidency, if he slams other countries with a tariff, let's remember what the tariffs are. And he has hit almost every country on earth with a tariff. Some quite high, some in the middle, some low. All right. A tariff means that a country and a company located in Venezuela or Nigeria or Canada, it doesn't matter, produces stuff and sells it to the United States. The minute it crosses the border from where it's produced into the United States, it is subject to a tariff. Tariff is just the name of a tax. It should be called an import duty, which in earlier American history was what we called it, but it changed later, tariff. Okay. What that means is that the seller, whoever that producer is in Canada, Nigeria, Zanzibar, wherever it might be, that guy is going to be hurt. Why? Because the American buyer has a higher price because you have to pay for the thing, and then you have to pay the tax to Uncle Sam on the thing. So what you can expect is you're going to sell fewer of whatever it is you make. So, for example, Canada is a very important source of lumber used in the United States in building houses. Canada is a source of oil and gas. Canada is, and so on, right? So the Canadians immediately had a problem. They went into panic mode because we are their big customer. We're very rich and we're right there on the border. You know, you put the tree, you cut it down, you put it on a truck, and you go a few hours, and there you are. You can sell it. It's profitable. But the United States is going to buy less lumber because the price just went up by the tariff that Trump put on it. All right, they can sit there and suffer a reduced demand. That's going to hurt them. Or they can call up whoever in the world they have good relationships with and try to market the lumber they can no longer sell in the US there. That's one of the biggest things BRICS is now doing. And what it means is that the presidents of these companies or these countries that visit Trump in Washington, and he tells them, "I don't tariff you," well, they give him the middle finger. You know, not where we can see it, but in private. And they tell him, all you're doing, Mr. President, I would rather sell in the United States. I value my customers. We have a relationship. They pay on time, blah, 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 blah. I'm not leaving, but you're giving me no option. In order to keep my business going, I've got to find customers somewhere else. And since I'm part of the BRICS and I meet with them and we have relationships, of course I'm going to ask them. This is not an aggressive act against you. It's you who put the tariff on me, starting this whole crazy business. But if you want to know whether the BRICS are getting together to help the rest of the world cope with and turn away from the United States, yes, that is going on. But that's not the intent. That was never the idea. Many of the people in the BRICS, the leaders, go out of their way and say, for example, we don't want to replace the dollar because to replace the dollar is to create uncertainty and disruption in the world money. The dollar is a very calming, universally accepted and understood. So you actually get people who say we have to be free of the dollar inside the BRICS, and others who say, don't be stupid. The dollar is a good framework for the rest of the stuff we have. They have to work that out. For the time being, the latter group have prevailed. They're not doing much with the dollar replacement. The critics who are radicals and want to go further attack the leadership of the BRICS for not going further to displace the dollar. They haven't gotten the argument yet that, look, everything else the BRICS is doing that we want is made possible because we have the protective cover of a global dollarized economy. In other words, you have to have some subtlety and some notion here of the complexity of the thing. Otherwise, you'll make an ideologically comfortable decision, but practically will come back and haunt you later.
So zooming in a little bit more micro to like kitchen table issues, will the ascension of the BRICS economy affect our quality of life in the West? And what can the average working person experience or expect to experience here, especially in rural and industrial areas?
Okay, let me give you some examples to answer. The BRICS have no interest in disrupting your kitchen table issues here. The BRICS would like nothing better than to be able to sell their products in the United States. I was about to say, and buy from the United States. We don't have very much left that they want to buy, but they would like to buy our high-tech stuff, our the Silicon Valley and all that still is exciting for them, and Apple is still the great telephone company. but they mostly want to do trade with the United States, and the BRICS do not push against that. But let me give you an example or two of where this idea might come from. Mr. Trump, at various times, threatened China with enormous tariffs. I don't know if you paid attention, but 100%, 200%, I mean, just wild things. And that would hurt those Chinese industries that sell in the United States. And there are a lot of them. I mean, in my classroom when I teach, I say to the students, because, it gets a giggle out of them, if I asked you all to stand up and take off your pants and take off your shirt, giggle, giggle, giggle. And I say, look at the label in the back and made in China, come up to the front and put it on a pile over here, made in China versus the pile over here, made in the U.S. Well, for clothing, as I'm sure you've noticed, made in the U.S. is kind of rare, whereas made in China or something is kind of frequent. All right. So when he threatened, the Chinese said, if you do that, we will retaliate. That was one of the first times that Americans who couldn't quite believe it were being forced to see how the world has changed. He wasn't doing what von der Leyen did, the commissioner of Europe. When she came here, Mr. Trump said, we're going to hit you with a tariff. And she asked, what do we have to do to get a lower tariff? Completely different answer. Mr. Xi Jinping said, if you do that, we will retaliate. Well, he went ahead and did it. And the Chinese retaliated. Let me show you what they retaliated. They went to their partner in the BRICS, Brazil. And what is it that Brazil produces? Well, it turns out that Brazil is a major producer of soybeans. Well, if you go to the Midwest of the United States, you will quickly learn that corn and wheat are very big products, but so are soybeans. And the American farmer in many states depends on producing and selling soybeans to China, where soybeans are a basic part of the diet. A basic part of the diet. China doesn't buy soybeans here anymore. It buys Brazilian soybeans. And once you have a ship full of soybeans, well, you put on some Brazilian bananas, which they grow heavily, and beef, which they raise. So I don't know if you noticed, but last week, Mr. Trump dropped the tariff on Brazilian soybeans, beef, and bananas. He's trying to get the Chinese, but now you're working out a deal. You're not telling people what to do. That's the relationship. The BRICS are not a danger to us. It's really in if we try to solve our problems at their expense, they will, in self-defense, react. Then our kitchen table could be affected. But other than that, no. And indeed, Mr. Trump, not that he intends it, by doing what he just did, by lowering, I don't know if he lowered it or omitted it, but suddenly the Brazilian beef, bananas, and soybeans have no tariff attached to them. And when he explained it, Mr. Trump gave away the story. He said, I'm getting a lot of complaints about unaffordability, that Americans are going to the supermarket and it's costing way too much to have a brown bag full of your weekly groceries. Okay, so I'm going to cut bananas and beef and soybeans because that'll make the consumer better. But the BRICS didn't start this. The Chinese didn't snatch the soybeans of Brazil. Everything indicates the Chinese would prefer American soybeans. That may be they taste it. I mean, I don't know what that's about. But they were buying here before they went to Brazil. They went to Brazil because of a retaliate, which they said, to the tariffs Mr. Trump put on them.
Okay, so thank you for that, Professor. Looking out over the next decade, as we fast forward over the next 10 years, what does a successful BRICS look like? What is the single most important thing that it needs to achieve in the next 3 to 5 years to be taken seriously as a counterweight to the G7?
Well, I think what we're going to see over the next 10 years is both a growth of the BRICS and a consolidation. They have two kinds of, they have a full member and then they have something that's not quite a full member. It has a name, but I have forgotten it. They're going to consolidate. I think they're going to get rid of that because that smells like, a full person and not a full person. That's the kind of thing that gets you into one kind of disaster after another. So I think you're going to see a consolidation. I think you're going to see other countries either because they're in trouble or because they see the advantage wanting to join. My understanding is there are about somewhere between 8 and 12 countries now that are not members but have requested to become members. I don't know exactly how they manage all of that, but I've heard that. And that was the case before. The most important recent addition has been Indonesia. It is now a BRIC member. I believe it's the most recent one. And that's quite a formidable addition. People think of Indonesia as very far away and how much of it. That country has about 250 million people. It's not quite the size of the United States, but almost. That is not a minor matter to have a mass of people. It's also a little bit of an unusual country because it is spread out over thousands of islands that are in one, country. So my guess is they're going to consolidate. My guess is they're going to grow. More and more countries do not want to be left out because as they grow and they consolidate, you're going to see contracts in which a country that's not a member notices that one BRIC country has just signed a contract to buy this or sell that to another BRIC country. And if you're outside the BRICS, you're not in the bidding and they want in. And they may be told, I don't know what the policy of the BRICS is, but I would guess that they're eager to have more people. And again, it means that there's more of a consolidation around China because China is in that world what the United States is here. It's just an outsized giant among smaller things. And I mean this economically, not population, obviously, but economically.
Well, thank you for a super engaging and informative conversation. I just have one final takeaway question for you. To close, if you could leave our audience with one key insight about the rise of BRICS and China's role in it, what would that one key insight be?
China is a very old civilization. We in the United States and the West are by comparison younger. Yes, Europe has been around a long time. China has been around at least as long. But the dominant force in the West is a very young country, ours, the United States. Whereas the dominant player on the other side is one of the ancient cultures. I think they understand better than we do the rise and fall of empires. The world has had many. The one thing we know is every one of them is born, evolves over time, and then it passes away. Just like human beings or cats and dogs do. And the Chinese have had their empires. They know this in the guts of their culture. And they want to survive. They know they're the ascendant. You'd have to be deaf, dumb, and blind not to see. Even Americans now see it. They don't quite want to understand it all that well or look at too close, but they kind of get it. I can tell, even in the last 4 or 5 years, when I tell the story there's less and less shock. There's they're not happy to hear me say it, but they know. They know this, they know that. Now they see me put it together. They can tell that I'm not making it up because they know enough to know, sort of which way the wind is blowing. Uh, it is my hope that the example I gave you of the United States and Britain will serve this country, the United States, well, and that they'll understand that they have to take the initiative to say, let's sit down and work something out so we don't come to blows, we don't kill large numbers of people. In many ways, Ukraine is a kind of proxy war. The poor people of Ukraine are getting smoshed, but it's really Russia, which is over there, and the United States in the West over here, and China behind Russia. So it is a kind of horrible dress rehearsal for what this can mean. You know, the way it is in Gaza. What what does a settler colonialism do if it tries to hold on past the time when history allows such things? You know what you get? You get that, and that's more horrible than even than the Ukraine. So I think that that's a possibility. I think that reasonable people will be either persuaded or frightened into looking for another way, not yet another provocation. Not when Barack Obama said we're going to pivot to Asia, my heart sank. I don't want I don't want another Cold War. I am acutely aware, having been born into it and lived most of my life and all my education in the Cold War, that it didn't do the United States much good at all. Risked unspeakable horror. The Ukraine is still a lingering result of all of that. Look how many Americans don't understand that Russia under Putin is not the Soviet Union under Stalin. Can't make that distinction. It's sort of bizarre. So I'm hopeful. I really am hopeful that the success of China and the BRICS will work as a way to make people stop and listen. If you travel to China, you come back a different person. You will see rapid trains. We don't have any of them in this country. They have them everywhere. You will walk down the street, the shopping looks like the United States in the better shopping neighborhoods. It's just all of the image of a terribly poor, backward country. That's all wrong. It's a leftover of a Cold War kind of mentality that doesn't want to understand what they have achieved. Last little story. I was in Paris, France, a few weeks ago, and I had to take a cab. So I opened the cab door to get into the cab. My father was born in France. I speak French. I have all my life, so I don't have to be a tourist when I'm there. So I start chatting with the cabbie, and I notice on the front BYD. I said, "Is this a BYD car?" "Oh yes," and he gave me a lecture on why his cab company uses BYD because they're so reliable and blah, 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 blah. I can't have that conversation in the United States, and that's ridiculous. It's just ridiculous. At some point, I think people here, I guess I'm a softie in the sense that there is a kind of practicality to the American mentality. And that's what I think we can appeal to. That'll take us beyond these ideological issues and make us realize we have more to gain by working this out with China than we have to lose.
We 100% agree. And thank you so much for joining us, Professor. Your words of wisdom are as valuable as always. And we look forward again. We look forward to having you on again.
Thank you so much for making the time for us. I feel like I got a ton out of this. I studied history also, so not through an economics lens, but a lot of bottom-up history, and just a lot of what you're saying really resonates with what I studied in college, and I'm very passionate about. So,
hey, Solidarity TV is an independent grassroots news organization. That means we rely exclusively on support from viewers like you. Support us at solidaritytelevision.org.
Welcome back to Solidarity Television. In this second conversation, we are zooming in on the key player in BRICS, China. It's the group's largest economy, its most vocal proponent for expansion, and is often seen as its primary architect. We're here to unpack Beijing's specific strategy. What does China want from BRICS, and how is it going to get it? Joining us now is Vijay Prashad. So we're going to start with the grand strategy of China's why. So let's talk about the fundamental goal. Beyond the rhetoric of multipolarity, what is the core strategic objective of China in leading and expanding BRICS? Is it primarily to dilute Western influence, or to create a guaranteed market for its goods and capital, or is it to build a block of diplomatic support on issues like of Taiwan and Xinjiang?
Yeah, it's a pretty good summary that you've laid out of all the reasons. Yeah, and in fact, because China is a very large and complicated society and state, probably somebody in a position of authority would agree with some of the statements. You know, there need not be a singularity of opinion, because joining the big BRICS process brings together a very large number of people inside, the Chinese state project. So I think all of them are probably pretty good, but I want to focus on two of them. One is the practicality. I mean, it would be silly not to see the BRICS as a direct consequence of the collapse or the slow collapse of Western markets, of the credit crisis of 2007, of the disappointing way in which Western governments reacted to that collapse. And so countries of the global South began to have a serious discussion about building South-to-South markets. So certainly that is true. It would be silly to avoid that. But further than that, I think it's also true that the Chinese were looking for a southern platform that was not the G77 or the non-aligned movement. China is not a member of the non-aligned movement or the G77. So it would have to join these at a very late period, when they're already formed, shaped, and so on. So I think probably, if I was to make a guess, if I was in the Chinese leadership, I would welcome something like this, because I could be there from the beginning to help shape it, rather than join the non-aligned movement at a time when it's sort of out of breath. Yeah.
So I want to follow up by asking specifically, Vijay, how does BRICS fit into China's broader vision for global governance, if you want to put it that way? Is it meant to parallel the G7 structure, or is the goal eventually to replace the Western-led order entirely?
Well, right after the financial crisis, 2007-8, the countries of the G7 started to say publicly and to tell the global South countries, look, we're going to wrap up the G7, we're going to close it down, started in 1974, it's no longer necessary, and the next major body as the kind of executive of the world is going to be the G20. That's what was said. Sarkozy, the president of France, said it directly. Yeah, it's a public notation. He said, we'll wrap up the G7, move things to the G20. But that didn't happen. Yeah, that didn't happen. The BRICS was not a counter. It was not the G5 counter to the G7. The BRICS was set up to establish better South-South cooperation for trade. It was not set up as a political body. Initial discussions were really about trade and getting to know each other, academic exchanges, visas, and so on. It's only as the years went on and the US imposed a greater Cold War on the particularly on China, that it began to have political relevance, or it began to resonate politically. But I would not like to say that these people are thinking of it as a counter to the G7. I mean, the expansion of the BRICS was largely on commercial grounds. All the oil countries were being brought in, save Venezuela, which Brazil basically vetoed its entry. But I don't think it's entirely being thought of as strategic, because if that were the case, then I think they might bring in some other members. They might have made a really hard sell to bring in Mexico, which would disrupt the United States, in a direct way. But there was not that. So I think even now, although the BRICS is more political, it is not seen, by its secretariat as a political body. It's seen largely as a trade and development body.
So a China-centric ecosystem seems to be what we are very much looking at here. We see China pushing for internationalization of the renminbi, the RMB with its Belt and Road Initiative, and its tech standards. To what extent is BRICS becoming the primary institutional vehicle to promote these Chinese systems globally?
Well, the thing is that the Chinese system, as you call it, or the Chinese project since 2013 with the Belt and Road and so on, is actually parallel with the BRICS. It's not incorporated into it. It's a separate thing. I mean, that's about building or using the Chinese massive surpluses to recycle them into new projects overseas, whether it's to build industrialization in Africa through the Forum on Africa-China Cooperation, FOCAC, or it is directly through the Belt and Road and so on. These have nothing to do institutionally with the BRICS. They are not incorporated. And I think the Chinese are quite diplomatically aware that they cannot, sort of impose their will on something as delicate as the BRICS. I mean, the BRICS is a delicate project. There are various political views there. Even the New Development Bank, although based in Shanghai, is in a sense held hostage by the Indian director. So I would be loath to say that the Chinese instruments are being operationalized in the BRICS. And also the renminbi is interesting, the Chinese currency. It's going to be impossible to internationalize it, because China will refuse to reduce capital controls. And if you can't reduce capital controls, your currency can't become international. So there's a limited way in which it is used, which is basically is an exchange currency for direct trades, like with Russia and so on. But I don't think there's a push in China to internationalize the renminbi itself.
So kind of digging a little bit deeper into China's how and how they use their influence within BRICS, how would you say China uses its economic weight within BRICS? Is it through direct investment in member states, by being a primary trade partner for most members, or through leading its role in the new development bank, or all three?
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting. It's related to the previous question, but the Chinese are not that interested in instrumentalizing the BRICS by itself. China is interested in trade with the BRICS countries, which is why in August they launched this fascinating index. Yeah, it's a BRICS trade index, which shows you how much inter-BRICS trade is happening. If you go and play with it, it's pretty fascinating. You can do it. You can look at it anywhere. Like you can just look at two BRICS countries and see what's the mutual trade. But this has the composite index available, and it already is showing the strong growth between the various BRICS countries. Yeah. So I mean, the Chinese are interested in that, and you've got to understand, though, it's the customs administration that created the BRICS index. It's not the political side. They are interested in trade for sure. I mean, that's without a doubt that China is understands that as it becomes the leading trade partner of countries, it has, of course, a political impact on those countries. That's true. But look, nobody should be fooled about this. The largest trading partner by far for Australia is China, in both directions. Yeah. Meaning their imports and exports. The largest number of exports go to China, largest imports come from China. And yet Australia is part of the new Cold War against China. So merely having lots of trade with a country doesn't give you real political influence if the country has a different kind of political and ideological bent. So we shouldn't exaggerate that, the power of trade.
The power of the purse. In the NDB. Speaking of the NDB, how much influence does Beijing wield over the bank's lending decisions and strategic priorities? Are we seeing a convergence between the NDB's projects and China's own Belt and Road?
I mean, it's interesting because the New Development Bank emerged with a great deal of fanfare and hope. And President Dilma Rousseff, former president of Brazil, is in her second term there. First time nominated by Brazil, second time nominated by Russia to stay on in the bank. But the agenda of the New Development Bank hasn't really advanced. It's going to take time. They are not lending at a fast clip. In fact, the People's Bank of China is much more aggressive in its lending. And by the way, the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, which is a very large Asian regional body, is set to build its own trade mechanism. So, I mean, it might build a development bank and work much faster than the New Development Bank, because the New Development Bank has to have directors from all the BRICS countries, and they set the agenda. So the agenda is not very fast moving.
So I want to dig in a little bit, because as you've already alluded to, right, the influence of China is maybe a little bit overstated within BRICS. So I want to ask, how does China attempt to possibly steer the agenda when facing resistance, or how does that resistance play out with other member states like India?
It's interesting because the assumption is that the Chinese have some interests that are extraterritorial. Yeah. I mean, the Chinese government is extremely interesting because it's a classical problem of a left-wing government, that on the one side you have to protect your national interests, because if you're not like ending poverty for everybody, what kind of government are you? And second, you have a sense of internationalism, So the Chinese have enormous sense of internationalism. Chinese doctors, like Cuban doctors, go all over the world. I was once on a train in Morocco and I met a group of women from China. I asked them, what are you doing here? Well, we are a maternal health team. We are here for 4 years. I don't see doctors from Europe or the United States go and spend 4 years in a small town in Morocco providing women's health care, essentially. So the Chinese have this internationalist seam. You just don't see it that often. They are out there doing their things. But the national interest is very, very strong, that they want to make a deal that improves China's situation. So, in a sense, one has to understand it like that. Influence, well, they have a couple of pressing issues which they basically sorted out. Nowadays, most countries accept that there is only one China and Beijing is the capital. There are few countries that talk about Taiwan as the capital, or Taipei as the capital of one China. But most countries are not there. It was very different until the 1970s. When China got the permanent seat at the UN and the United States acknowledged there's one China and Beijing is the capital, things changed. So that issue, trying to win votes in the UN on Taiwan and so on, that issue is no longer so germane, and that's the principal issue that worries the Chinese government. They know that if a country comes out there and starts making statements about Taiwan, as the Japanese Prime Minister did, that upsets people in China a lot. So I don't think they are seeking influence, say, about what happens in Latin America, what happens in Africa. I don't see that happening. I think they are most interested in their national interest and in their neighborhood.
The senior partner problem. Does China's dominance risk creating a perception of BRICS that is merely a vehicle for Chinese interests politically, or potentially alienating other members like Brazil and South Africa, who have also have their own aspirations for leadership?
I don't see a tussle for leadership of the BRICS. I think of it as a pretty bland body, in fact. I mean, every BRICS meeting, the conversations seem pretty straightforward. And the declaration seems very much like the declaration from the previous year. There's very little I don't see the tussle. I may not be seeing everything, and there may be some high level things happening that we don't get access to. But I really don't see it. I don't see anybody trying to take over the BRICS. I see them actually cooperating pretty well. They understand that you have a presidential year. You can do various things. The next year, somebody else has it, and so on. I don't see any jockeying for power by anybody.
So looking ahead to the future of Chinese leadership, what would you say a successful BRICS would look like from Beijing's perspective in 2030? Is it measured by some kind of specific percentage of global trade in RMB, maybe a formal security pact, or a specific reduction in the dollar's reserve status?
Well, firstly, I hope they don't have a security pact, because we don't need any more of that. We have the UN Charter. That should be sufficient. That's a pact. That's a security pact. 193 countries have signed on to that security pact. We should scrap all the others. NATO and so on should be closed down. So I hope BRICS doesn't become like a southern NATO, should not go in that direction. What I would like to see, however, having said that, is BRICS taking on what the United Nations has not been able to do, which is to set table to end conflicts. Why hasn't the BRICS body sent a delegation to Sudan to have a talk with the various leaderships of the conflict, discuss the question of human migration in that area, transhumane migration, discuss the issue of gun running across the Sahara, discuss the issue of migration and so on, the Gen Z median age and all of those things. Why hasn't BRICS entered that? Why hasn't the BRICS bloc attempted to send emissaries into Gaza to have a conversation with the various parties there, talk to the different, see what the actual distress is and produce a report? Why don't they go, well, they're at it, to Myanmar, where there's a war on which very few people know about between four armies? Why aren't they there? I mean, why don't the BRICS countries use their heft politically? I think it would be very beneficial for the world for them to be on the ground in these conflicts, trying to shut them down.
So the cost of leadership, would China be prepared to be the bloc's ultimate underwriter? Is it willing to offer more favorable trade terms, write down its own debt, or provide security assurances to keep the coalition united? And if so, under what conditions?
You're talking about the BRICS, yeah, which is basically a paddock where people are coming in, and they're getting to know each other. Yeah, it's a living room. People are coming in, getting to know each other. The first 10 years of the BRICS meetings, heads of state had to understand the political culture of each other. They didn't know each other. I mean, and also they keep changing. Yeah, okay. The Indian leader has been there since 2014. Yeah, he keeps winning elections. Lula in and out, yeah. Xi Jinping has been there the whole time. Putin has been there the whole time. South Africa in and out, yeah. Cyril Ramaphosa now, and so on. I mean, and then they widen the story. They got to get to know each other, trust each other, and so on. I mean, a lot of international relations is about building trust, building, personal relationships with each other, and that takes time. And I think, like I said earlier, the political thing is impossible in that space, because they don't actually come together for a politics. They come together for economics. And to convert an economic bloc effectively into a political conversation, very difficult to do.
Kind of leading right into, from what you just said there, imagine a global crisis situation like a Taiwan contingency. Do you think that China could count on BRICS members for diplomatic support in a situation like that? Or do you think the bloc could fracture under that kind of pressure? And what does that tell us about the true depth of these partnerships, as you're saying? What does that tell us about the level of trust and political alliance that's been built as opposed to economic?
I mean, firstly, I don't think any country will join a military confrontation. I just don't think it's going to happen. Yeah. I mean, what do we assume? Russia and China don't have a military pact. They have a security pact, much lower than a military pact. Russia, I doubt, will enter a conflict like that. Yeah. India, certainly not. South Africa doesn't have the military capacity. It's just not going to do it. So China would, in that sense, not have the BRICS military support. I mean, Saudi Arabia, Iran, who's going to trot along, But what you will get is diplomatic support in the UN and so on. They will support, China. If China is attacked, they will support China. That is without a doubt. Now, the question is that, what does that support mean? What does it entail? You want to put a resolution. If one of you is in the Security Council, you could put a resolution in. What is that going to mean? It'll be vetoed immediately. If it's a US-China conflict, somebody's going to veto it. Talk about the General Assembly. It's really it's a good view of how the world sees things, but they don't have any enforcement mechanism. So, I mean, most countries are just going to sit back and watch. And I think the Chinese understand that.
You have helped shed a lot of light on BRICS and had helped us clear up a lot of misconceptions that we have here in the West due to our own media. Recently, we were reading that Russian Prime Minister Alexei Overchuk said at the 47th ASEAN summit that Malaysia had been identified as a potential strong partner for BRICS. Could you talk to us a little bit about what some of those developments are in Malaysia that makes them such a strong partner?
I think that his statement became anachronistic immediately. Anwar Ibrahim, the Prime Minister of Malaysia, in the last few years has been sort of center-left, talking about Gaza a little bit, responding to popular upsurge for the Palestinians. The ASEAN meeting happens, and Mr. Trump walks in and basically says, you can't sign a deal with the Chinese. Any deal you sign with any country, you have to pass it by us. Sign this form. That's what he said. And Anwar Ibrahim signed it. So I don't think Malaysia is right now a good candidate to join the BRICS. I think Anwar Ibrahim was compromised in the same way as the president of South Korea was compromised, gave away his exchequer, 85% of it.
Is there any final thought that you want to leave our audience with? Any big takeaway about BRICS, China's role in it, or anything else that you want to add?
Well, the first thing I would say is congratulations on your show, and I hope it has great success and builds a nice audience of kind and decent communists and others. I hope very much that's what happens. And I want to say that there will come a time in the very near future where you will see spontaneous outbreaks of protests as they happen because of the contradictions of history. And you're going to see young people like you in the midst of those spontaneous outbreaks, trying to shape them in the way only a trained militant can do. So that's going to happen. That's going to happen sooner than you expect.
Thank you so much for joining us, Vijay. It was a pleasure speaking with you, and we really look forward to having you on again in the future if you're open to that. If you've liked what you've heard, folks, and enjoyed this presentation, please, like, subscribe, hit the bell for notifications. You can also follow the link below to our Patreon, where you're going to find more content, including our new magazine, currently in development, called The Crimson Letter, available January 1st of 2026. Vijay, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you, Vijay.
Thanks a lot. What a lovely name for a magazine. I hope that does well as well.